Okay, in this video, we're going to look at how we can make a prediction from data, and we can see what's a good model that might fit that data. So over here, I'm going to be trying to model the value of the Canadian currency over time. And so here, I'm looking at, so I got this data from the Consumer Price Index from StatsCan. And so here, I have one column, which is years since 1950, and then I have the value in Canadian dollars. So if something was worth $100 in 1950, 10 years later, so 1960, it'd be worth 122. 20 years later, it'd be worth 160, et cetera, et cetera. So we can see that things have increased quite a bit over time, and we want to try to find a model to make a prediction. And this is going to be our motivating question. So if something cost $100 in 1950, we want to know how much it would cost in the year 2050 using this trend. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this data again. So I copy this data. I'm going to open up Desmos. And all I need to do here is I'm going to hit Control V, and that's going to paste my data into a table for us. Okay, so we can see we have this trend line here. This tells us on the x-axis the years since 1950, and then this tells us on the y-axis, that's going to tell us the value. So we can see over here, this is our first data point, 20 years later, started at $100, 20 years later it was worth 160. 30 years later, 354. So it's been increasing over time. So first model I'm going to try to use is I'm going to use a linear model. So that's y equals mx plus b. So we do y1 is approximately mx1 plus b. And you can see that we get our model looking like this. Now, I've noticed something strange about the model. And one tool you can use here is what's called a residual. And that shows us the difference between our model and the data. Notice there's a pattern to the residuals, and that gives me a clue that maybe our model isn't the best model. The residuals should be kind of random, but I'm noticing that they follow a very predictable pattern. And so what I'm looking at here is maybe this function here is not a very good model for our data. So maybe linear doesn't work. So I'm going to try another model here, and I'm going to try using a slightly different model. I'm going to use an exponential model. So y1 is approximately a times b to the power of x plus c. Okay. And so I have to put in x1 because I need it to reference the function. And now I'm looking at this here, and I'm seeing that this exponential model actually seems to give us a much better idea of what this is going to look like. Now that some of the data is going to be below, some of the data is going to be above, but do you notice how the residuals down here, much more random, not as clear of a pattern with the residuals, and my data seems to really follow the trend quite a bit better. And so with this, what I can do is I can say, well, I can use this to make my interpolations. So 6 years after 1950, so 1956, that would be worth just $100.56. But as I continue along, I can see how things increase. So 50 years later, so this would be the year 2000, $100 would have been actually worth $984. So things are increasing in price. This is what it's called inflation. And so what I want to do is I want to figure out after 100 years, how much is that going to be worth? And I need to go quite a ways up on this graph. And if this follows this pattern, this is what we might see. So in 100 years, that $100 might be worth $12,863 100 years later. So we can see if we continue this inflationary pattern, that's what we might see. Now there's a lot of assumptions that we make with this, but essentially that's what we're looking at is how we make that prediction for what's going to happen in 100 years using that model. So this is that exponential growth, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about in the news. And really this is what we look at when we make predictions using exponential growth, is that either we think it's going to continue growing like this, or we might see some other factors come into play. But essentially that's what our prediction would be.